Hey, thanks for tuning in to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Once again, Ryan Thomas here, talking all things sports, NFL, NHL, Major League Baseball, mixed martial arts, boxing, combat sports. Thanks so much for tuning in to the show today. A lot to discuss in regards to the NHL playoffs. Have not had the chance to discuss this topic on the podcast, and I'm really happy to get the chance to do so, of course. So, with that being said, the subject matter, the Oilers falling short and the Toronto Maple Leafs coming up short as well. Breaking that down, it's painfully obvious in this podcast. Let's not even allude to it. Let's just cut right to the chase. Who was I rooting for in the series between the Oilers and the Vegas Golden Knights? It's pretty obvious who I was rooting for, right? The Edmonton Oilers. Posting Oilers logos all week long, rooting for the Edmonton Oilers. And no, in case you've been living under a rock, it's not due to the fact that I'm an Edmonton Oilers fan. It has everything to do with the fact that I'm a Jack Eichel hater. I don't want to see Jack Eichel do well. I don't want to see Jack Eichel come even close to a Stanley Cup throughout the entirety of his career. Does that make me bitter? No, that makes me just a hater in that sense. I'm more than willing to throw that word out there when it comes to Jack Eichel, being that he wasted the last 5 years of the Buffalo Sabres' existence, or 6 years, however many years he was there in Buffalo, trying to drag my hometown city through the mud, trying to drag the fans into the dirt, proverbially kicked the fans in the groin area as many times as he tried to, and no one can convince me otherwise. So, no, I'll never root for that guy. I'm going to root for him to fail. I'm going to root for him to come up short. And I'm always going to root for the guy that'll always be better than him, Connor McDavid, to move forward and take a stab at getting his name etched into a Stanley Cup when it's painfully obvious right now that in the state of the National Hockey League that Connor McDavid is far and away the best player in the world, within the sport of hockey, of course. So, yeah, I was rooting for Edmonton to come away with that victory, rooting for them to win that series. And the fact that they didn't is very frustrating. The fact that Vegas advances and potentially Vegas advances to the Western Conference Final against potentially the Seattle Kraken, and those are the two newest teams in the National Hockey League. It makes me quite sick, to be quite honest. Due to the fact that the Buffalo Sabres, the team that I've rooted for ever since I was a little kid, been in existence since 1970, they have not won a Stanley Cup yet, and Vegas has played in one, and Seattle could potentially play in another. So, of course, and Vegas could potentially as well play in another Stanley Cup. So, of course, I don't want to see these teams do well when they're this new and expansion franchises that were allowed to kind of build their team off of plucking talent off of others. I can't stand that, and Gary Bettman probably woke up this morning in silk sheets and silk pajamas, stretched his arms out, saw the sun overlooking his fabulous villa or his fabulous mansion, and he's probably feeling pretty good right now, given that is more likely than not to be the result of the Western Conference Final and being the Vegas Golden Knights and the Seattle Kraken. But the teams that have fallen short, there's a time and place to talk about the Eastern Conference Finals that are looking like it's going to be Florida and Carolina, of course. And there's a time and place for me to go into those series, and I will do that because I think these four teams, potentially, unless Dallas pulls a surprise, these four teams are very interesting matchups in the Stanley Cup. I obviously have enjoyed seeing Florida beat the Boston Bruins in shocking fashion and beat the Toronto Maple Leafs in shocking fashion. But I want to talk about the teams that did get knocked out of the playoffs. The Edmonton Oilers in particular, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and yeah, we'll throw in the Boston Bruins. And talking about the Bruins first because they got shocked the most, right? They had 63 wins this year. They were a freight train all regular season long, went months without losing at home, players that were putting up 60-goal seasons, and David Pastrnak and Linus Ullmark putting together a Vezina Trophy campaign. Patrice Bergeron, his last season in the National Hockey League, they anticipated that he could hoist the Stanley Cup in his last season. And that all came to a screeching halt as the Florida Panthers beat the Boston Bruins in Game 7 of what was the Eastern Conference quarterfinals. And now, to put it simple and plain, the Boston Bruins that year, this season, is just a footnote in one of the greatest choke jobs in recent memory in sports history. You know, the fact they won that many games, they were heavily favored to beat the Florida Panthers, and President's Trophy winners this year facing off against the President's Trophy winners last year that came up short in Florida. Florida found a way to scratch and claw, pun intended, their way into the playoffs as the Panthers barely made it. And then they beat the Boston Bruins in 7 games. They beat the Toronto Maple Leafs in 5 or 6 games. And those were the 2 teams in the East that everybody feared, that everybody anticipated would make it to, you know, the semifinals or quarter, you know, advance at the very least. And neither team was able to get past Florida. So, of course, I think the Boston Bruins are going to undergo a major reset. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're one of the older teams in the playoffs. And this was really their last dance to really try to put a run together, and they came up short. The Toronto Maple Leafs, I have no idea right now, in this moment, earlier today we'll say, going back to earlier today, Maple Leafs general manager Kyle Dubas said that he's either the general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs or he's not coming back to general manage any team in the National Hockey League. Bold statement for one of 2 reasons. He's kind of predicting his future without his future really being able to process itself. You know, you're a mere couple days away from being eliminated, and your general manager of your franchise comes out and says, I'm either staying or I'm not going anywhere ever again. This is either me moving forward or I'm not moving forward at all. And you're kind of playing your hand there a little bit too quick, right? Because if, in fact, he does not go back to Toronto, he's done. But he's kind of making the decision for his bosses. Whereas his bosses could say, well, if he's saying he's either the GM here or nowhere, then it is nowhere. Because what reason would the Toronto Maple Leafs ownership group have to provide Kyle Dubas with an additional opportunity when each and every year the Toronto Maple Leafs, who I've always referred to as the Dallas Cowboys of the NHL, have continued to come up short each and every season with a nucleus of Austin Matthews, Mitch Marner, and Johnny Tavares. And then you throw in the fact that they traded for Ryan O'Reilly, for Christ's sake. I mean, it's really shocking that all that talent on one team can't get it done. And their defense, by many standards within, you know, the opinions and the minds of hockey minds that are far more intelligent than mine, come out and say that this is the best defensive group that the Toronto Maple Leafs have had. And yet, what happened against Florida? What happened in that series? That wasn't what they thought. That was not the product they thought, but it was the product that the majority of NHL fans knew they were going to see. And that's why I kind of refer to the Toronto Maple Leafs as the Dallas Cowboys, because much like the Dallas Cowboys, the Toronto Maple Leafs are a very talented team, and yet the fan bases that are not within that team's fan base, the fans that are not within the Maple Leafs fan base or the Cowboys fan base, are the only ones that really seem to know the reality of the situation, whereas the fans of those teams, Maple Leafs fans or Cowboys fans, have this wholehearted belief that this is the best team since, sliced bread. And it's never the case. They're never right. They're always wrong. And they're the ones that are kind of sitting on their thumb, hoping and praying that they're right in the postseason, come to find out that they're not, and they just get pushed to the ground and pointed at and laughed at. You'd think they'd learn, but they haven't. They haven't learned. I don't know if they ever will learn. And it's to a point where I truly feel we're at a point where it's going to be a very interesting conversation when you look at Boston, when you look at the Toronto Maple Leafs, when you look at what's happened with these teams, that it's just a situation where they all need to hit the reset button. The only one that shouldn't hit the reset button that I think is close to getting to a Stanley Cup championship more than anyone else that has been eliminated so far is the Edmonton Oilers. I can't explain to you guys why they came up short against the Vegas Golden Knights other than the one simple fact that a rookie goaltender by the name of Stuart Skinner came up extremely short in these playoffs and looked like a completely different goalie in the playoffs for the worst of reasons in comparison to how he looked in the regular season. If they can get that right, and it's going to take a long time to get that right because now Stuart Skinner has got to start all over again, rebuild himself back up, forget about the bad memories that he played of the playoffs, within the playoffs, forget those playoff memories where you came up very short and looked terrible in the playoffs. Try to put that in the back of your mind and put yourself in a situation where you're hitting the reset button and using those negative moments for the better. It's almost like when you have a bad day at work, but you have a full year to get it back. Not another day. You get a full year to get it back. Very hard for Stuart Skinner, and I feel for the guy, but this was not his best performance against the Vegas Golden Knights. But if I'm the GM of the Toronto Maple Leafs, I am hitting the reset button, and I am saying to Kyle Dubas, thanks, but no thanks. If you feel like you want to be the GM of this team, that's great for you, but you're not calling the shots. We're calling the shots. And this team has been constructed in a way that was to win and win now, and we didn't do that. So it's time to move on. Boston Bruins, time to move on as well. And if that is the case, if Toronto does move on from the Marners, the Matthews, or whoever they move on from, because one of those guys has got to go, they can't pay them all, that will cause a drastic shift in the Eastern Conference, which will only benefit teams like the Buffalo Sabres, like the Ottawa Senators, like the New Jersey Devils. Something to keep our eyes out on if we're Buffalo Sabres fans, for Ottawa Senators fans, if we are New Jersey Devils fans. Because Boston and Toronto cannot move forward with the rosters that they had this season. They just can't. Things will change, and they will change drastically. And I'm looking forward to seeing it.